Hi, this is Tutor Nick P, and this is Lesson 10, How to Read Roman Numerals in English. I want to do a video on this one because a lot of times when I have students and they're actually reading text from magazines or from books, and they come across Roman numerals, and it can get a little confusing because sometimes we read Roman numerals as cardinal numbers, and sometimes we read them as ordinal numbers, and I'll explain that in a second. But let's just quickly review some of the basic Roman numerals. I was actually kind of lucky because in my high school that I went to, they actually required, besides English, they required students to take a classical language and a modern foreign language, and I chose Latin, so I did learn it there. I don't think that most students, because I wasn't taught anywhere else, and I don't think that they still actually teach it to the average student, although maybe some students learned it somewhere along the line. But it's good to know the very basic, especially if you know the numbers under 20. That'll probably cover you for most of the time when you come across it in English, reading about it, either following names of people or in movies. So let's take a quick look first. Alright, of course, this is 1. 1 looks like a big I, a capital I in English, and then it just goes along. So 1, 2, 3 is really easy because it just looks like 1, 1, 1. It gets a little tricky in Roman numerals or in Latin once you get to 4, because in Latin they kind of went the opposite way. They really kind of B is 5, but 1V is 4. So if there's another letter on the right side, then it's actually minus. So here, this is 1 minus 5 is 4. So 1V is actually 4, where V by itself is 5. And then after 5, getting all the way 5 through 8 gets easier because, again, it goes back to normal. So, V1 is actually 6. V11, of course, is 7. Yeah, so what looks like an I. And the same thing with 8. V11 is 8. But when you get to 9 and 10, it's the same sort of situation as 5. 10 is X. But if you want 9, you have to do a 1 in front of the X. So it's really 1 minus 10 is 9. So it's a little tricky. And then again, after that, it just follows the same system as the first 10. So x1, of course, is 11. x11 would have been 12. x1111 would have been 13, and so on. And then also to note, of course, it gets easy. Once you get up to 20, would be xx. And they do the same thing later on. It gets tricky, just like 5 and 10. Once you get to 50, 50 is L, but if you want 40, it's XL. So it's really 10 minus 50 is 40. That's the way they do it in Roman numerals. That's the way they did it in the old Roman Empire, in Latin. So of course, I'm not going to go through every single number. If you follow this system, you can put it together yourself. Just like this one here, 24 is XX, which was 20, and then you take the 4 here, and that's basically 24. Yeah, just put these to a side because you have to look at 4s and 9s. You should pay special attention to because they're the ones with the minus. So 29 would be XX 1x, so 2 x's and then a 9. 1 minus 10 is a 9, and the same thing happens with the 30s and the 40s. XXX is 30. So, just to move on quickly, because I don't want to spend all the time on the numbers. Again, 90 would be X minus C. C is 100. So, so this would really be 10 minus 100 is 90. Alright, and then you get D is 500. CM, M of course being 1,000, so CM would be 900. Although most foreign students, ESL students, usually don't have to worry about numbers that are this large, not very often. Like I said, mostly probably numbers under 20 would probably cover you the far majority of the time. All right, so let's quickly review like how you read them. All right, so first let's distinguish. So you might be reminded, even native speakers sometimes need to be reminded of the difference between cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers. So we learn them in school, but you like learn them in first grade, second grade, and a lot of people forget what they learned in first grade and second grade. So cardinal numbers are read as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's the normal ones. So when reading Roman numerals, sometimes, again, I'm just going to repeat this point, sometimes they are read as cardinal numbers and sometimes they are read as ordinal numbers. Alright, so this is an example of when they are read as cardinal numbers. So we say World War I. Just to quickly review, ordinal numbers are like first, second, third. So that's what we mean by ordinal numbers. So we don't read this as World War First, we read it as World War I. And of course World War II, and hopefully we will never have World War III. So they are read as cardinal numbers. So again, right here, I wrote it out how you would read it. You read it as World War I, World War II. Another common one that you might see a lot is Roman numerals in movie titles are also read as cardinal numbers. So, you might say Spider-Man 2, Godfather Part 2, Rocky 3. So you do come across this, especially today we have a lot of sequels. And sometimes that's how they simply make the title of the sequel, by adding a Roman numeral. Okay, let's go down to ordinal numbers. And I'm going to repeat this point again. Ordinal numbers are read as first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on. That's how we read them. So Roman numerals are read as ordinal numbers when they follow somebody's name, especially kings, queens, popes, etc. They're probably the most common ones that you will come across. Another tricky part with names followed by Roman numerals must also include a "the" when it is read. Yeah, this is especially tricky for ESL students because there's no hint of this. Even native speakers probably realize it just because they heard it so often. There's really no hint even for the native speaker. It's just not there. You're expected to know to read it. So let me give you some examples. King Louis the 14th. Again, X, 1, and B. So 1 and B is 4, X, so that's 14. But we read it as 14th. So I wrote down here how we would read it. Remember, he was a French king, so a lot of times in French, the last letter is sometimes silent, so that's why that's read as King Louis instead of King Louis. King Louis the 14th. So we have to read it with a "the." And I gave you some other common examples. King Henry the 8th. That's how you would read this. These are ones that we hear about a lot in history. Recent popes. Pope John Paul II. Yeah, we don't read it as Pope John Paul II. We don't read it as King Henry VIII. We have to read it with a "the." So Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict the 16th. Okay, good. All right. Another example that we may come across, not so often anymore, but you still might see it. Another example of using Roman numerals after names is if you have a family of 3 generations or more of a father and son having the same name. Yeah, so these don't have to be very famous people like the kings and the queens and the popes. This could be, regular people. Although I would say that it is associated more with upper class people may have this. But of course anybody could do this. Alright, let's note this point too, because we come across this even more often. If it is only 2 generations, it is usually read as senior and junior. So if the father and the son have exactly the same name, we will call the father senior and we call the son junior. This might come across, like if they were still living at home, sometimes it's a good way to know who is the male really for. Is it for the father or is it for the son? If the son is still living in the house with the parents, the name that comes could be exactly the same name. So that's how you distinguish that. I just gave, a typical example, like Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, the famous one. was Martin Luther King Jr., so his father was also Martin Luther King. Okay, and this one I just made up because, you know, we don't see it that much, that we have the third and the fourth with this, but you could come across it. An example of 3 generations or more, and I just made up this name. Let's say Chester Williams, and you would read it as the third, and if it went for a 4th generation, you would read it as the 4th if it was, you know, 1V. All right, I hope that covers it. I hope that clarifies it. Again, for ESL students, where English is a second language, you know, when somebody asks you to read or you're reading aloud, you want to make sure that you read this correctly. Yes. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I hope that's clear. Bye bye.